Hello, everybody, to the first Best at Work webinar of 2026. I hope that you're having a great year so far. At a certain point, I stopped saying Happy New Year to anybody that I talk to, but I'll still say it because I haven't talked to many of you. Happy New Year. I heard somewhere that you have to stop saying it on January 10th. I don't believe if that's true or not. Well, let's just break some rules. All right. So before we get started and we start talking about what will actually move the needle when it comes to employee engagement in 2026, I would love for all of you out there to share a little bit about yourself. And let's do it this way: share where you're dialing in from, and because spring is right around the corner, what's your favorite thing about spring? All right. So where are you dialing in from, and what's your favorite thing about spring? Start sharing so we can make some good connections as we start the conversation. Tiffany in New Orleans, I have to agree with you on that one. I love New Orleans. I love crawfish. Tulips, the snow being gone. I can appreciate that. The weather, the cubbies. That's fantastic. I appreciate it. Keep it going so we can make some good connections here. I'm going to start sharing my screen so we can get the presentation going. But keep talking, keep connecting. This is one of my favorite parts about these webinars is having many of you having new connections. All right. So, you should all be seeing the slide now. All right. So we're going to do this similar to what we've done in the past. If you've been a part of these webinars with me and Best Companies Group, then you know that this is definitely a conversation. So I'm going to be sharing some of the research that we've done that we found that we believe is very important to share with all of you. And I also want to encourage all of you to share your questions. There's a Q&A button in the Zoom bar where you can submit your questions there. I will, throughout the presentation and more likely at the end of it, go there to answer as many questions as we can during the time that we have together. You can also submit them in the chat. I might not be able to see those as much just because sometimes it gets flooded. So just please feel free to add them to the Q&A if you have a question that you really want to have answered. And then throughout, there's going to be a couple of opportunities for us to connect again and hear what you're doing currently in your organization when it comes to employee listening. And we really hope that this is super helpful for all of you. So to kick us off, I just want to say something that you probably all are very well aware of. Most organizations don't have a listening problem. What they have, what we all have, is a decision problem. We keep collecting more signals through surveys, pulses, comments, because we feel like collecting feels productive. But listening really only pays off when it changes what leaders do next. So today we're going to talk about turning listening into an operating system. One that makes priorities clear, one that makes our managers better, and one where employees are more likely to believe you the next time you ask what they're thinking. And as we all know, when belief goes up, everything else gets easier. Participation, candor, and of course follow through. So a little bit about myself. My name is Jaime Raul Zepeda. I'm from Best Companies Group. And Best Companies Group, for 20 years, we've been studying the same question. What makes a workplace work? Not in theory, but in real organizations with real constraints. And what we've learned is pretty simple. Great workplaces, they don't guess, they measure, they benchmark, and most importantly, they act with discipline. So today I'm going to give you a system of sorts that you can run even if you're a small team with a big mandate. There's no theater components to this. There's no survey for the sake of serving. We're just going to talk about a practical way to get to the truth and, again, something I'm going to highlight a lot throughout this presentation, do something useful with it. So here's the scoreboard. the things that really matter for not just HR, but really any business out there that's thinking about talent. Retention of their top talent, manager effectiveness, the energy that their employees have, burnout and anxiety and stress is a very real thing. Loneliness is a very real thing in 2026. And probably one of the most important things right now is productivity. So the survey is not the product, right? These outcomes are the product. This is what we're trying to get to, and these are the things that we're trying to improve. The survey just happens to be part of the equation. In the research that we've looked into, engagement has definitely softened to the 2020 compared to the 2020 peak. 2020, it was a high year when it came to engagement, in large part because there was a lot of people that were making the move to remote work, and that was very novel, but also very appreciated by a lot of people. We've definitely seen declines, and we've seen declines show up in really basic stuff. Clarity, care, and development. Those are the big things that we've seen decline in the last 6 years. And so that's essentially the warning label for all of us, right? Listening has to connect to those fundamentals. Otherwise, we're just going to measure disappointment and we're not going to create any momentum. I'm sure those are all things that you already know. Let's start with a poll. Again, going to the chat. Tell me, where do you think your listening breaks down? We have a few options here. Low participation. The results are messy. It's hard to really prioritize what's going on. Managers don't act, or they don't know how to act on the results. Leaders won't make the trade-offs, or employees just stop believing that anything will change. All right. So just try to be as honest as you can about where you think things stop when it comes to listening, either surveys, focus groups, exit interviews, all those things. All right. So I'm seeing survey fatigue, managers not acting, results are missing, managers are not acting. Yeah. So as you can see, there's a lot of commonality, right? And so let me just share a few tips depending on where you are and what you've answered here. If you see that participation is low, that's not necessarily a reminder email problem. Like it's probably not that you're not sending out enough emails. It's a trust problem, right? And we're going to talk about today. It's a trust where people don't feel like anything will happen with the results after they submit their feedback. If you find that the results are messy, that's usually a design problem. There's too many questions and not enough data to make decisions, right? Not the right data to make decisions. If managers don't act, that's usually an enablement and accountability problem. They don't have what they need to have the conversations they need to have. And also, very importantly, they don't feel like they need to be held accountable to these things. If leaders won't make trade-offs, you don't need better analytics, you need governance. You need some sort of structure and some people that are helping you govern and manage this process moving forward, especially when hard decisions need to get made. And if employees don't believe anything will change, then your next survey is guaranteed to fail before it launches. Okay? So today we're going to fix the things here that we talked about, and we're going to share some tips. So here's a paradox, right, that the research that we looked into shared. We are listening, and by that I mean surveys, focus groups, all of those office hours, all those things. We are listening more than ever and closing the loop less than employees need. U.S. engagement, just in the U.S., averaged about 31% last year. And that's down from the peak that I mentioned of 36% in 2020. And that matters because disengagement isn't neutral. It's very expensive. And the biggest gap is not the questions. The biggest gap that we see is the middle of the pipeline, where feedback goes in and then nothing visible comes out, right? So if you want a 2026 advantage, it is not more listening. I want to reiterate that. It is not finding more ways to create listening opportunities. It's faster proof and more tangible proof that the feedback matters. Because people don't hate surveys. What they hate is wasted effort. What we looked into saw that fatigue was a predictable non-response when the experience is low value or high friction. What this means is when it feels like shouting into a black hole, right? So the cure isn't fewer questions alone. The cure is making the exchange feel more fair. If you ask, you owe, right? That's, if you take absolutely nothing else from this webinar, that's the one mantra you should take. If you ask something of your employees, you are creating a contract with them to say, we owe you something. Doesn't mean that we're going to change the things exactly as you want it, but it does mean that we owe you a response, we owe you action, we owe you our thoughts on that. And you can do this, acknowledge, you can pay back this debt through acknowledgement, by setting priorities, by updating things on how they're going. And so if you can't do that yet, that's also helpful information. If you feel like, yeah, I can ask, but I can't really follow through on the feedback that we're going to ask, that is super important, because then that tells you that the issue is not so much with getting feedback and getting the data you need. It's more so the middle of the pipeline, as I mentioned, what happens after you collect the feedback. So every time you ask employees for feedback, you are essentially borrowing from a bank account that, let's say, we'll call it credibility, right? So if you don't pay it back, the interest rate spikes. You only have so many opportunities to ask and not pay back, as I mentioned, not to pay back what you owe. And so really that's the danger that we've seen. And this has happened more and more each year because we're doing a lot of listening. Organizations, thankfully, are paying a lot more attention and putting a lot more resources into listening opportunities. Survey platforms, internal surveys, pulse, dashboards, office hours, all those things are resources that are being put together. So it's not that there's not enough there. It's what happens after you collect the feedback, right? It's the belief. So if employees don't believe you'll act, your response rate is just a measure of hope, right? So our job here is to turn that hope into some level of proof. And a lot of organizations run surveys like events, right? 1 year, big splash, or once a year, I'm sorry, big splash, then gone. And so what we really need is the operating system that I mentioned earlier. And so the operating system focuses on decision focus, right? What outcomes are we listening for? Signal design, what you listen and why. Why are you putting those questions in the survey? Why are you asking those questions of your people? Synthesis, how signal becomes insight. You get all this data. What does it mean, right? Execution, who does what by when. This is where the drop-off begins. A lot of data, a lot of insights, but then who does what? And by when does that happen? If you don't have these questions answered, there's no accountability. And then closure, very important. You told us this, we did this, and let's measure how you think about how we did, right? That's where you do the double check of, you told us this was important, we spent some time and resources on that. Do you feel like we made some movement there? So this loop is sort of like a narrative arc, right? You listen, you decide, you deliver, you recheck. And notice what's not in this loop, right? We're not looking at a really fancy dashboard. We're not debating the data forever. We're not creating a amazing 47-slide findings deck that nobody ever looks at more than once. In the post-listening research that we've done, and the way that we help our clients go beyond just data and insights and actually into action, success clusters around rapid acknowledgement, then, this is the harder stuff, manager-enabled action planning, disciplined prioritization, we can't work on everything, so what are we going to tell our leaders to focus on, governance, how do we keep this truck moving forward, and visible proof. How do we show people that we listened and we acted? So this loop forces that, right? You can run it at any size, whether you're a small organization or a large enterprise. In fact, small and mid-sized organizations can often run it faster than enterprises. There's fewer layers, faster decisions, and it all depends on whether you keep it disciplined, right? Now, why is this here? Absolutely no reason other than I love bears and I thought this was funny. So, I hope you think it's funny too. That's it. Back to the presentation. So this is the sort of like the decision readiness test, because the biggest survey mistakes is launching without decisions. So you first have to ask, what decisions might change? This is way before you even launch the survey. What decisions might change? Who, if we decide to go down that path, who will own actions? And try to put it down by name. If not, then by role. And what will you tell employees within 7 days? Why 7 days? Because you got to tell them something, right? Otherwise, again, it feels like the feedback went into a void. You don't have to tell them what you're going to work on. You don't have to tell them what's going to change. You do have to tell them, thank you for your feedback. We've noticed that there's a lot of feedback around these topics. We're going to have a conversation around it in the next X days. Expect to hear from us by X date. That's it. You can even be a little bit loose on the dates, but just something that says, we got it, we heard it, we'll get back to you. All right? And then a really important question is, what can you realistically change in 90 days? Again, before you even launch the survey, you know what the questions will be. Take a look at those questions and think, if they gave us some really strong feedback around these things, are these topics that we could realistically make some kind of change in the next 90 days? If you can't, then it's not so much about, if you can't answer these questions, it's not so much about needing more questions or needing more surveys or more ways of listening. You need to have an alignment conversation with the rest of your leadership team, with the rest of your leaders, right? Why are we even doing this? And if we're not ready to act, maybe this is not the right time to do it. So I think it's very clear, but let me just reiterate this. Employees don't fill out surveys for HR. It's not a favor that they are doing for their HR department. They fill it out for themselves, right? They are sharing what the future of the organization they'd like to see is, right? That's why it's really important to consider third-party surveys. One, to make sure that confidentiality isn't just a nice to have, it is a must have. It gives you more candor. Benchmarking is really important. It's not a vanity decision. It helps you calibrate. Without it, you really will have likely the conversation between leaders where they say we're doing fine when they're not, or sometimes this happens too, they panic with the data when they shouldn't. So benchmarks are incredibly important. And our experience also shows that follow-through is a chronic weak spot. Many employees don't feel there's good follow-up. So third-party partners help reduce politics, sharpen the interpretation, and make the path to action a lot faster. Because trust builds when you have clarity in the equation. And so if you're thinking about a vendor, these are questions that you should definitely ask. You want to make sure that they don't just give you nice features and goodies and, you know, bells and whistles. They actually help you achieve outcomes. So these are the questions you should definitely have whenever you're shopping around. First, how do you protect confidentiality? They need to be able to give you a strong answer on that. What thresholds do you enforce to make sure that the confidentiality is protected? What benchmarks do you have? And where do they come from? And how custom can they be so they make sense to my organization? You don't want to be benchmarked if you're a 50-person organization in healthcare. You don't want to be benchmarked against a 500-person bank. Doesn't make sense. There should be some overlap, but not enough to help you really understand how well you're doing. Also, how do you enable managers, right? How do you provide us an opportunity to move things forward by helping our managers make sense of this and carve out some action items? And how, very important, how do you help us identify the levers that matter most, that we should prioritize, rather than giving us 50 charts to look at. So, in our experience, guidance shows up clearly. Continuous listening requires resources, governance, and focus. And so the vendor that you choose should make the focus easier, not harder. And I just want to take a quick second to tell you about our proof story. So Best Companies Group has helped over 10,000 organizations across America with employee engagement measurement and improvement, especially around employee effectiveness over the past 20 years. And we don't just do this through surveys, which we definitely do have. We bring benchmarks built from studying thousands of certified best places to work and best practices that sit behind those results. And that matters because HR does not need more data. You have plenty of data. You need better decisions and faster execution. So our work is designed for that. Everything that you see in this presentation is essentially what we help organizations with. We offer credible confidentiality, clear comparisons, practical analysis, manager-ready guidance, and a cadence that helps you turn feedback into visible progress. This is where most launches are won or lost. These are the decisions that end up marking or predicting the success that you'll have. There's really 10 main decisions when you're thinking about a employee listening strategy. One, what's your audience? Is it everybody or is it a sample? What's your frequency? What's the mix of annual surveys versus pulse surveys? Confidentiality, how are you protecting that? Question set. How are you designing the survey so you make sure that the questions are clear and helpful? Benchmarks, reporting, segmentation, once more, tied to the confidentiality piece is how do you make sure that you get feedback as much as you can without sacrificing confidentiality and without hurting the integrity of the survey. Action planning, is it something that's going to be part of this process or not so much? Communication, what are you going to say before, during, and after the survey? And governance, who specifically, ideally as a person or as a team or role, decides what the priorities will be. If you get these right, your survey will definitely become an asset. If you get them wrong, you're just going to be creating more noise. And so one of the main things that we've seen in our experience helping a lot of organizations is you definitely do not want to measure and act on everything. It is just really going to dilute the experience and going to give you a lot of data, but not really a lot of helpful information that can move things along. So this is a blueprint, right, to help you to help create some momentum while also restraining yourself to not do everything. And a quick note about small and medium organizations. So if you're in the 10 to 500 employee range, I would highly encourage you to do a full census. That's usually the trust move. It really tells everybody everyone's voice matters. You can make this work with sampling, like a random sample, but sometimes it's a shortcut that will cost you belief. And the real issue here is in census versus sample. It's whether you can feel safe reporting the results and saying that they're useful. If you can't provide team level insight without risking anonymity, then you should not shrink the audience. You want to tighten your segmentation, you want to raise thresholds, you want to protect people, because once employees doubt confidentiality, the data just becomes real choppy real fast. And so think of this as like nutrition, right? When you're thinking about how to put together a mix of listening tools that work for you. You first need an anchor meal, right? What's the meat and potatoes to what I'm going to be eating today? And then you need some snacks. The annual engagement survey can serve as like the anchor because it gives you a lot of helpful trend-based information, helps you see how things are changing, and also helps you see how benchmarks are being stable. And then you have opportunities to do some life cycle listening throughout moments where things typically happen. Exits, entries, promotions. We'll talk about that in a second. And then you have the other snack of a targeted pulse. And we're going to talk about the pulse next. But remember that the pulse is really focused on what are we going to make a move on, more so than even the full survey. The pulse should be short, and the pulse should be focused, and it should definitely have something tied to it to say, because of this, we're going to shift our strategy, which we had set 8 months ago from the full survey, or we're going to make these changes, or we're going to have this response. You can't just leave it out there. Because pulse surveys are not meant to be therapy. It's not meant to be something that you throw out there and see, what do you think? Tell us what you have. Rant and vent to us. It's an instrument. So keep it tight. 5 to 10 items. Keep the wording really stable. That's the whole point of this. You want to have something that you check on it time over time. And you want to have an idea of what's the trend, what's the signal that you're trying to keep a pulse on, right? And the key role here is don't pulse faster than you can act. Otherwise, you're training employees that their feedback creates no change, only more questions. The pulse should answer a practical question like, are we improving clarity? Or something like, is workload easing? So life cycle listening. This is where all organizations, in particular small organizations, can win really big. Because you don't need like an analytics department to ask the right questions at the right moment. You have different trigger points that you should think about as to where do we listen. And again, this is not, you don't have to do a survey for each of these things, but you should have some kind of mechanism where somebody sits down with the person, the employee that you're talking to, and asks them how you're feeling. All right, so the trigger points could be 2 weeks in, it could be 45 days in, it could be at their 90-day mark, at their 6-month mark, promotions, anything like that. That's super helpful for you to understand how things are moving forward. And what you want to get out of this is preventable attrition themes. Things that are popping up more than once that help you act on these things fast. Again, always on listening, it's being thrown around a lot as like a very modern term until it becomes a complaint fire hose, right? And so my suggestion, if you're thinking about how do we create more listening opportunities versus just one survey throughout the year, is think about one channel, setting up clear rules, clear routing, and a response promise you can keep, right? So for example, I'd like to hear from all of you out there who are tuning in. If you look at the channels, right, that we have here, skip levels, office hours, retrospectives, also mixing in pulse surveys, exit surveys, annual surveys. Which one of these that you currently do in your organization do you feel is the most effective at giving you an idea of how your employees are feeling? So we have some options here, but also the ones I mentioned. If you just add in the chat, which ones work for you? Skip levels can be very helpful. Office hours, very helpful if people feel comfortable sharing. Retrospectives, more in a team-based way, helps people understand what worked and what didn't. Entry-level interviews or conversations. We also have stay interviews. For any of you that you've heard out there, stay interviews are very helpful. It's somewhere between entering the team and leaving. You're essentially asking, what would it take for you to stay here as long as possible with us, right? That's also a listening tool. So let's see, put it down in the chat and I'll take a look at it. Office hours, stay interviews, that's great that some of you are using that. Pulse surveys, yeah, exit interviews, fantastic. Yeah, exit surveys are really helpful, right? It's not great. It's not a great way of getting the data because unfortunately you are losing that person. But if you can tie it with the performance, right? What was the reason for that person leaving? If it was a regrettable turnover, then you're getting some really important nuggets on what will it take for you to keep the people that you want to keep from those questions in the exit survey. All right. But just remember that if you're having trouble with all of this, just try to pick one channel to focus on, create some clear routing rules. Is this something that the manager owns? Or is it something that HR owns? Or is it something that execs own, right? And one way of deciding who owns it that I found really helpful is essentially who can control or who can influence this decision within the next 90 days with what they currently have, right? That'll tell you, is it something that HR needs to be involved in and work on? Is it something that the manager can own directly? Or is it something that we got to kick up and have an executive conversation on? Is who has the locus of control where they can do something about what's being talked about within the 90 days with what they already have. Okay? So that's a way of finding out who should have the ownership, just to make it more clear. All right. I've mentioned this a few times, but just to reiterate, don't measure everything. Only measure what you're willing to manage. Keep a stable core of the questions that you want to keep track of. Add only a few rotating items per year, things that you're interested on that maybe are important this year but not last year, and so forth. And keep the text prompts limited and purposeful. Again, ask what you're willing to analyze. And here's some practical tips when designing the questions themselves. Use plain language. You don't want to put too many ideas in one question. You want to keep it clear. If a fifth grader can understand what you're saying, that's exactly what you should be putting down. Avoid double-barreled statements. Double-barreled statements is when you're asking kind of like two things at the same time. So whatever data they give you and feedback they give you, you're not quite sure what they're answering towards. Keep the skills consistent and include at least one intent outcome question. Something around, are you willing to stay here for the next 2 years? Are you willing to recommend us as an employer to a friend? Are you willing to go above and beyond because of your experience at this organization? That's an intent. And that can also really be very helpful, especially if you're working with a third-party vendor or you have these tools yourselves. It helps you understand what the key drivers are, right? Because then you can make the key driver that intent outcome and all the other questions to help you understand what are some parts of the experience that will lift that intent outcome higher so we can work on that and then have more people stay, more people put in extra effort. One quick note on response rates, right? Response rates is essentially your first referendum on trust. This is when they tell you, how willing am I to partake in this exercise because of what I think will happen? So treat participation like a product launch. Before, leaders need to explain why we're asking and what will happen after. During the survey window, reminders should also come from managers. And people need to hear from people they already know, not just HR. Because this will help you create a much better adaptability curve. You should try to remove all friction possible. Make it mobile friendly, make it as short as possible. Provide some time commitment that you think it will take. And really important, many times, don't just say it once. People think that you can just say it once and people will hear it. You got to tell them how their data will be protected, how their feedback will be protected. Confidentiality is essential to communicate. How is confidentiality being protected? And here's something you can say in your launch message, right? You can just copy this template and use it right away. Again, talk about why we're asking. Why does the survey exist? Why is the survey here? Here's what we'll do with it. Don't oversell it. Do share what you believe will happen. You don't have to make any promises, but here's the process that this is going to go through. How are you going to protect confidentiality? And here's when you'll hear back from us. As much as you can, provide the detail of the cadence of the follow-up. Incredibly helpful in increasing the trust, increasing response rates, and increasing the candor that you're going to get in your survey. Here's one of the biggest mistakes that we see organizations do. And it's super well intended, but unfortunately, it ends up creating a lot of harm. There's too many cuts to the data, and everybody, and too many people get reporting on everything, right? You get the survey back, you share the results to as many people as possible, and it's really great because everybody has access, and in this case, everybody, I mean like all levels of management. Everybody has access to the data, and a lot of fun digging through it, but unfortunately, it does a few things. If you cut it too many times, it will spread that those cuts are being thrown out there, and that's really going to hurt your chances of getting candid feedback the next time you go out. Also, too much data paralyzes action, right? Paralysis by analysis happens. So try to stick to reporting thresholds. What's the minimum group size that I'm willing to report out on? And also help managers focus. Give them two strengths, two opportunities, and some suggested actions. If you throw the data at them and ask them to find out by themselves what makes sense out of that, some will be very good at that, many won't, and that's going to create more work for you, and it's going to slow everything down. So less data, more clarity. Now, AI. I can't do a presentation nowadays without talking about AI for at least 1 minute, right? AI is really helpful at reducing the friction when it comes to synthesizing the data, especially comments, right? It's really helpful for clustering comments into themes, summarizing what the verbatims are saying, even drafting briefs, right? Here's what the data says, kick that over to your CEO, COO in a way that is clear and concise and helpful, but do not use it to try to find out everything, try to understand everything, right? It's not something that can help you score what's important and what's not. It helps you synthesize and bring down the friction and taking in all the data. And for what it's worth, Best Companies Group uses AI for a lot of these same things to help you understand primarily what are the comments saying and what is the signal amongst all the noise. So if you ever started a survey results, or ever stared, at survey results and thought, okay, so what now? It's a very common thing. Where our experience describes the common failure mode as over-collecting and underciting. So these are 3 filters that can help you fix that. First, think about impact. Well, moving this change, whatever it is that you're looking at, and the data point that you're looking at saying, like, that's interesting. Well, moving this change engagement, retention, or performance. If it doesn't do any of that for those 3, do not think about it. Next, can we move it in 90 days? If it can't, not saying you discard it, but definitely put it in the parking lot section for now. And lastly, very important, who can actually influence this? Is this something that the team can control? Is this something that HR can control? Is this something that the executive team needs to control? Right? This is where you understand how much can be moved, who needs to move it, and what the real focus should be. And so here's a tip on how you can try to navigate all the data and put it into something that can be helpful. And we call it the 2 moves, 1 fix. All right? So when you're looking at your data, you have it in front of you, you have the big old spreadsheet or whatever it is that you have, your dashboard. Is try to think about 2 things that will have the highest return and the lowest complexity to change in the next 60 to 90 days. Remember, it has to be both. So it can't be highest return, highest complexity. It has to be highest return and lowest complexity so that you know you have some wins ahead of you that you can take on. And this could be, again, HR driven, manager driven, executive driven. And think about 1 fix. What is the biggest risk reducer? And essentially it's like a constraint that's blocking everything else. It could be workload. It could be remote work is really creating a backlash and disengagement. It could be, retention. What's the biggest risk reducer that you have out there to focus on to say that's probably going to be more of like a long-term plan? So if you can't assign an owner, a metric, and a date to it, back to the previous slide, if you can't really work on it, it should not be a priority. I know it's not great to hear, but you have to think about what's within your control and what's within the scope of your influence. Now, when we're talking about action plans, we're really talking about how do we help managers not feel helpless, right? Not every issue belongs in a team action plan. Our experience shows that if you do that, when you put too much on an action plan, it creates topic distance, which is putting stuff on people's plate where they have no control around how to change it within the next 60 to 90 days, right? So once again, that's a measure, that's a question that you should ask. Is this something that the person I'm giving it to can change something within the next 60 to 90 days? If not, it should not be on an action plan, right? Does not mean it doesn't get worked on. It probably means it needs to be kicked up a level. If it's something that's important, but it can't be done at the manager level, then usually that means it needs to be an executive decision with a response rate of some sort. And the biggest things that we've seen in engagement in 2025 and moving into 2026 are things that have popped up in the past. They're still very important: manager quality and capability, role clarity, communication clarity, recognition, feedback quality, growth and career development signals, and workload. Burnout is something that is creeping up a lot, has creeped up a lot in the last 18 to 24 months, more so than it has in previous years. There's a lot of reasons that people throw out there as to why that's happening. Happy to have a conversation with you about that. I have my own theories, but it's definitely something that's happening. People are feeling burnt out and they're feeling lonely, right? Loneliness is becoming a very big part of the workplace in America in 2026, which of course does not help any of the other items. And a quick note on talking about multipliers, right? Don't spread effort evenly. You have to overinvest in multipliers. Managers are the biggest multiplier because they shape the day-to-day experience. And you can support them by providing them clarity, right, on what's important, what's not. Recognition is a great tool and also a great multiplier because it helps with retention control. It is one of the biggest predictors of retention. Do I feel like I've been recognized recently, on average, once a week or at least once a month? And our research shows that if you really want to spend some time and you have a retention issue, that's really where you need to focus on first. Make managers a crucial part of the post-listening action, right? Do not take this on as this is something that HR will fully handle. Help them understand core habits that will help them be stewards of the culture. Give them a action planning meeting agenda and script, and help them really get to a couple of actions that will help them have great check-ins with their team. And clarity is underrated because it's not glamorous, right? It's a superpower though. When roles are unclear, workload feels heavier, conflict rises, and recognition gets fuzzy. So this is a 45-minute team workshop reset that you can use, right? You can do this with any of your teams, or you can help your managers have that with their teams. You talk about priorities. You talk about what done means, essentially what success means in this team. Define the handoffs and define the decision rights. In this conversation, you're going to find recurring blockers. If your team, if your manager is doing this conversation correctly, they're going to be able to find some of the things that come up more and more again. Says, this is what gets in the way of me being successful. This is what gets in the way of moving, creating handoffs, of deciding what needs to be done. And you can then turn that into something that you check in on through weekly priorities or blocker meetings, right? This is a way where you can turn feedback that you get from a survey into something that your manager can then have a conversation on with their team in a more granular way. This is another listening tool that you can use. So recognition is not about being nice. It's about reinforcing the behaviors you want more out of. Think of it as a fire. What positive recognition do you want more of? You need to give it more oxygen. Through your managers, through the organization, many ways, you have to make sure the recognition is something that is a ritual within the teams that you have underneath you. What about growth? Growth is a very important thing. As I mentioned, it's one of the drivers that we've seen around engagement. So growth is something that can be approached in different ways, and it doesn't require promising promotions. You can do this by creating growth markets where people have skills goals. They can have project stretches, right? Projects that go beyond what they typically do, feedback loops. You can have quarterly career conversations. You can even publish internal pathways, even if they're informal. One way that I've seen organizations do this is they'll talk about someone within the organization that has had a great and long career within the organization and talk about how they got there, right? You know, Bill and Barbara, let's talk about both of them and how they started as an intern and made their way up to senior manager. What was their story? What did they go through? Who do they approach? Who are their mentors? You can share those kind of positive stories that give people an idea of what they might be able to do. You're not promising that that's what's going to happen to them, but you are telling a story about what's possible here. So, real quick on some workload and burnout fixes. As I mentioned, this unfortunately is creeping up a lot recently. Some even blame the hybrid or remote change that's been happening. Some organizations have been doing that well, others haven't, and this has unfortunately led to workload and burnout situations. Um, the research shows that the balance between demands and resources, when demand stays chronic, burnout rises and engagement falls, right? So we have to fix friction, handoffs, approvals, meetings, rework, anything that gets in the way of people really getting some momentum in their work. Then I really recommend that you run experiments. Don't send this off to a committee. Run a quick, short experiment for 2 weeks. Say, what if we did it this way? What if we did not have that handoff, or we did not have that approval process, and we kind of empowered that initial person a little bit more, and see what happens. And then you decide, do we keep it or do we kill it, right? And then you can then figure out what the next fix would be, because whether you're able to make some traction on that or not. And over time, you're going to be saving your team time. But you have to first have the conversation around what are the friction points, and start really putting your scientific hat on. What are some experiments that we can run at a local level with the team to try to fix it? So I want to share a quick study, and then I'm actually going to move a little bit further along, of an organization that we work with. This was a mid-sized professional services firm. They had tons of data. They had decks that they had been given by previous organizations. They even had like their list of top priorities. So they were doing a lot of the things right, but they didn't have decisions. And so what the survey became was a report card, not a roadmap. It was just like, how did we do, and who needs to be, hit with a stick. So we helped them change the system. We talked about 2 moves and the 1 fix model. We gave them a manager toolkit. We helped them set up a cadence model, 70, 30, 90 in their case, that really worked. And we helped them make their wins visible within the organization. And so that's really the pattern that I'm trying to emphasize here, is you want to do rapid acknowledgement, disciplined prioritization, manager enabled action, and show proof. And then the outcome of that will be trust. It may not lead to immediate change in the survey, but it will lead to increased engagement and effectiveness over time, because now you're telling them the story of, we are hearing you, we want to do something about this, let's work together. So speed matters, especially when it comes to responding to survey results. Make sure that within 7 days, you tell them what you heard, what's in and out of scope. Within 30 days, you talk about some actions. It could be, we're having a conversation. That could be total actions, right? It could also be, we have had a conversation, and here are the things that we're going to start working on, and who owns those. And within 90 days, make sure that you start sharing some progress updates, ideally if some things are already changing or in the process of changing. I'm going to include this here real quick so you can take a picture of it, but obviously there's more detail to it. This is how you can run an action planning meeting, or your manager can run an action planning meeting. You want to focus on the strengths and opportunities, but then you quickly want to move into what's some things that we can start, stop, and continue, and what are some actions, defining owners, dates, and resources that can get us there, and then let's commit. When are we going to talk about this again? Right? It doesn't have to be overly complicated. This could be something that the managers themselves could do. It's a script that they can run, and it also helps you free yourself of having to do those directly. All right, one more time about governance. Governance is how you turn good intentions into shared accountability. So the research that we've dug into highlights governance, tracking, and visible proof as essential, especially as listening becomes more continuous. The more you do it, the more governance you need. So we need to assign roles. Executives, they typically will own enterprise priorities and resource decisions. HR will typically own the process and create enablement assets, right? Managers will own team actions and updates, which is both down and above, right? The updates need to be happening where the manager shares with their team what things are changing, what things are improving. And also, they got to go one level above and say, here's what I'm doing with my team based on the action plan that I committed to. And governance, and executive controlled items need to live in some way where there's response dates, right? This all needs to be something that's visible and tracked in some way where it feels like a project, right? Governance may sound a little bit bureaucratic until you realize that it's what helps prevent all this go into a black hole. Employees are not expecting you to be perfect, but they do need to know what's happening, who's deciding it, and by when. Here's some leading indicators that can help you understand if your employee listening strategy is on the right track. Obviously, participation is something that you can find out and look back on and see, is our participation rate staying stable, going up, going down? Manager action completions, if you've done those, how many of those have actually been completed? Time to close the loop on these sort of things. And some lagging indicators is obviously retention risk, internal mobility, and are you having some performance issues, right, that you are constantly being pulled into. So find your stable core. What are the things that you want to focus on, both on the leading side and the lagging side, so you can make some traction? And here's something that you can do in the next 30 days. All right, so this is near the end of our conversation here. Think of your first week over the next 30 days as something where you dig deep into decision readiness. Are we ready to look into the things that we're going to ask people about? Governance, how are we doing with governance? Is it something that we need some more help on and to help prevent things going into a black hole? And start drafting your communications as well as reviewing previous drafts. Are we doing the things that we talked about here? Are we telling them why this is important, what's going to happen, and all that? In the second week, take a look at the questions that you have asked in the past or the ones that you're thinking about asking. Are they properly put together? Are you communicating how confidentiality will be protected? Are you setting reporting rules that will help you share feedback in a way that is helpful and not paralyzing, but also protects the confidentiality of the people? After that, think about how are your managers being supported and how are they participating in this setup, in this project. They need to be core to it. They can't be something that is optional. They need to be a part of it. And in your last week, excuse me, think about your lunch, start drafting your reminders, and start thinking about when are we going to follow up with people after we send the survey at the 7-day mark, 1 week out, at the 1 month mark, and at the 3 month mark, right? The research shows us that failure is rarely about collecting, it's about the follow through, right? So we want to make sure that we bake follow through into the calendar. If you're launching in 2026, your competitive advantage will not be a bigger survey. It will be a better system, a plan that gives you a system. So one last time, I want to share that plenty of providers out there run a survey, but very few can turn it into measurable improvement, and that's what we do. We have a 20-year track record and 10,000 organizations that we work with across America. We help employers earn trust, boost participation, and act on what they've learned from our third-party confidential surveys, right? We have exclusive benchmarks informed by really researching and studying thousands of best places to work. And what we do is we deliver clear priorities, leader-ready insights, and manager-ready action plans so that the survey actually changes how work feels and how teams perform. And so right now, if you're planning an engagement survey this year, I want you to take a look at us, right? And if you schedule a quick appointment by February 27th, which is next Friday, you can schedule the appointment for some time after that. I'm just saying if you want to schedule something and have it in the books for sometime in 2026, I will provide you with a free action plan guide, which talks about what we talked about today, but in more detail with some templates on how you can move this forward, some talking points, how your managers are involved in this, typical cadence of how this goes, a script of the entire meeting, free of charge, right? We just want to have a conversation to see if we can maybe help you out with your employee engagement listening needs. You can also email me there at jzepeda@bestcompaniesgroup.com. All right, so I'm going to leave this up as I go to the questions. We have a few of them. Great, so would you do a state interview with everyone or a sample? That's a great question. It depends on what situation you're in. If you are in a situation where retention is an issue, turnover is high, and you're losing people, especially people that you do not want to lose, I would think about doing it with as big of a sample as you can bear. I don't know how big your organization is. Obviously, if you have a few hundred people, it's going to be a little bit more challenging than if you have 20. But it depends on, is there an issue already? Then you want to increase the sample as much as possible. If there's not an issue, I would start with your high performers, right? And again, this doesn't have to be HR doing it. This is your manager doing it. And you can provide them a script that helps them do that. There's plenty of good stuff out there on Google. Um, the intent of the meeting is to show, hey, I want to check in how you're doing. I want to make sure that you're getting what you need from us and from me for you to feel comfortable staying here for the long term. The manager just doing that is a huge signal to those people that they care. So again, if you don't have an issue of retention, but you kind of want to get ahead of it, I would start with your high performers. See what will it take for them to continue to stay there and to feel like they can thrive. If you have a bigger situation around retention, I would increase it as much as you can. And the goal of this is to eventually synthesize all of those points, right? Not just keep them within the managers, but to set up some sort of project where you say, let's do this over the next 30 days, and then in 45 days, let's huddle up so that we, potentially HR can facilitate this conversation, can hear what you heard, right? That's the whole point of this, is to synthesize and see what are the trends that we see around here. All right. Another question, excuse me, how do I get leadership buy-in? Great question. So again, it really depends on a lot of things, but one of the things they often recommend organizations do when they're thinking about how to get leadership buy-in is to speak in their language, right? So if leadership right now has a lot of conversations and strategy goals and focus around certain things like revenue, EBITDA, market share, brand, reputation, any of those things, take a look and take a second on how will improving employee engagement and effectiveness increase those items, right? So you want to make sure that you're always framing the need to go a little bit deeper and more thoughtfully into listening to your employees by showing them what's in it for them, right? Because that's their metrics. Those are their metrics that they need to follow to be successful. So that would be my number one step, is to pay attention to what's important across the business and what are executives talking about the most, and fold your argument into that to make it as persuasive as possible. All right. And then can I get a copy of the PowerPoint? Yes. So I believe the PowerPoint will be sent out to, if not everybody, then let me know, and you can send me an email directly, and I can send that over to you. Okay, let me just check real quick. I think those are all the questions I have here. If you have another ones, you can squeak it in. Great. So, yeah, I think there's some questions here, but I think I covered all of them. So if I missed any, please let me know. Send me an email. I want to make sure that this is helpful for everybody. I really appreciate your time. I really appreciate you being here and joining me in these conversations. I hope it's been something that you can take back and start thinking about or employing right away. And if you want to take a picture of that QR code, that sends you directly to the meeting link to schedule a meeting with me. Or again, as I said, you can just email me directly and we can set up some time. All right. Until then, hope you have a great rest of your week. Be well, and talk to you all soon. Take care.